Okay, let's talk about processing EMG. There's lots of options with processing EMG, and it's always good to know what you want to do with EMG before you actually start collecting EMG. And so one of the critical things with EMG is to have some kinematic marker, some indication as to when to start processing and when to end processing, other than the arbitrary moment in time where you hit data record. All right, so what I'm going to do is talk about two broad approaches to EMG processing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that kinematic part and selecting the data. The two broad approaches are time domain analysis and frequency domain analysis. Now, I'm actually in this video here, I'm going to focus in on the time domain, and then I'll do another video on frequency domain. Let me just briefly distinguish easily between the two domains, and this is for any data set. And I just drew it here. If this was EMG, and I've left it for both positive and negative data. A time domain analysis is anywhere where time, or any plot where time is on the x-axis. Okay, has to be on the x-axis. A frequency domain plot, and I'm going to put a little different set of units here. I'm just going to call this EMG power right now. Okay, I'll explain that more later. And on the x-axis is frequency in hertz. Okay, this is how you tell you're in or looking at a frequency domain analysis by looking what's on the x-axis. If time is on the x-axis, it's time domain analysis. If frequency is on the x-axis, it's a frequency domain plot. And the plot, if this is the same data set, they're actually interchangeable. They're actually giving you the same information, but we need to be able to understand why we would want to use a time domain and why we would want to use a frequency domain analysis. I'll go through that in a separate video. But right now, what I'm going to do in this video is focus in on the time domain analysis for EMG processing. All right, so let's give this a 1. Otherwise, I'll get too long in my explanation and it'll be too long for video. All right, so let's do time domain analysis. EMG time domain analysis. Lots of options on time domain analysis, but there's going to be some rules that we'll follow from mostly in our lab, and there will be similar rules in other labs as well. But first, let's just recognize what an EMG signal will look like. And I'm going to use millivolts on the y-axis. Sorry, dog is trying to get in the room. Later on, we'll change these set of units, but this is just to recognize that EMG is a voltage. And if we go to our system and we hit go and collect data, and we're doing some type of activity, I don't care what it is, and we're looking at the EMG of some muscle, we're going to get something that's going to look like that. Roughly, we're going to see these periods where there's bursts of activities, and then some periods where there's not much activity at all. The question is, what do we do with this? Well, we always need to have a way to extract the data for analysis. All right, so we need to extract data. Now, analysis, sorry, bad spelling. Now, there's lots of different ways to go here. What is nice is if there is some kinematic marker that goes along with this EMG data set. That kinematic marker may be some position data, maybe an Elgon, or maybe it would be acceleration or from an accelerometer. And that's the Cometa system has accelerometers. And you got to remember how to interpret acceleration in order to pull out the correct phases of data. There's other ways to do this, and I'll go later on and explain some alternative approaches. But I'm going to start with this idea that you need some kinematic marker to be able to say, I'm going to start my analysis at this moment in time. Or maybe it's this moment in time, or maybe it's even this moment in time. But you need to have a reason and an objective measure to be able to say when data analysis starts. This time right here is where I just started, I pushed the button, collect data. That time 0 is just arbitrary. Okay, it has no meaning. So you need something that goes along with this. And maybe what you have, I'll just do it this way, maybe you have an Elgon. And this is in degrees. And maybe you've got an Elgon that does something like this. And maybe this is, I'll tell you a little bit more about the activity. Maybe this is flexion and extension of the elbow. I don't know, something. But it's the Elgon set up on some joint, and we're seeing a repetitive pattern here. And now we can see that there's a link between whatever has happening here, what's happening up here. So we want to analyze our EMG data. First thing we need to do is set a criteria for when to extract the data for analysis, when to end. And maybe you want to extract based upon a minimum angle. And maybe it's minimum to minimum, okay? And maybe you do multiple cycles. Or maybe it's max to max. Or maybe you calculate velocity off of this and then acceleration, and then you take a max or min of that. Whatever the criteria are, you need to specify them. And this is why you want to think about your data collection ahead of time, so you're collecting the right material, right measures in order to do something with the data. But let's say right now, I want to extract from a min to a min. What I would do is identify in my MATLAB where that minimum occurs. And then I go up to my EMG data and I say, that's the start of my data analysis. And then maybe I just want to do one cycle. Maybe I want to do multiple cycles, okay? Lots of different ways you can go here. But maybe I go from min to min, and maybe this ends up being a data set that I extract for analysis. Yeah, lots of different ways. I can maybe do multiple, maybe I go 5 cycles, whatever it is. And then I pull out data for 5 cycles, something that we've been doing with swimming, for example. All right, so this is one way to use a kinematic marker, in this case an Elgon, to extract your data. You've got to look at what kinematic marker you're going to use in order to signify when the data analysis starts and when the data analysis ends. Okay. So now let's go with that extracted data set. And now what I'll do is I'll extract the data for that one cycle. And I'll just put it right here. Okay. And now we're just going to analyze this data set. There's actually some things I could have done before the extracting the data. Should I do all right, let me go back in time. What I would do, even at this stage, is I would do two things. Even at this data set right here, the first thing I do is I remove the DC bias. Or another way to say this is remove the zero offset. What that means is sometimes when you collect your data, I drew it too nicely. Sometimes the data are shifted off of zero and they hover above zero or some way over zero, okay? You want your data set to have a mean of zero before you do anything, okay? So what this does, by removing the DC bias or the zero offset, you are setting mean of data set to zero. Okay, so how do you do that mathematically? You calculate the mean of the entire data set and then you subtract that mean from every data point and you'll get really close to zero, okay? So subtract mean from every data point. Okay. And then you end up with a mean of zero, or it's pretty close to zero at that point. That's how you remove the DC bias. The second thing I typically will do, not always, okay, but this is very typical, especially in the time domain analysis, is I will rectify the data. What rectification means is I'm going to make all my data positive. And there's two ways that we can rectify the data. One is a full wave, which is equivalent to taking the absolute value of all the data. And all these negative data points simply move up to being positive. And that's typically what we do in our lab. Another way is just to do a half wave. And that's get rid of anything less than zero. So any negative data, okay? So in essence, what you do is just wipe out anything below zero. I typically don't do that. That would have been a common way if you're having some computer processing issues and you want to minimize the data that you're working with. That was an acceptable way, is just to take away anything less than zero. Conceptually, what's happening here is a positive signal simply means the action potential is moving in one direction relative to the leads on the skin. The negative simply means the action potential is moving in the opposite direction. So remember, we're actually measuring multiple action potentials. So either the action potential is moving towards the lead or away from the lead. And so it's either going to be positive or negative. So that's what the direction means. That's why either of these techniques is fine, but I like to do a full wave simply because then I'm keeping all the data set intact at that point. Okay, so those are two things I typically do for a time domain. Sometimes we don't do this step if we're doing frequency domain though. Oops, frequency domain. So right now we're doing time domain, so we do both those steps. Okay. So now I drew my 3 like that, but now I'm going to get rid of that page and I'm going to start a new 3. And I'm only going to draw my full wave rectified data. And so now it's going to look like that. This is still my extracted data. Okay, still extract. It's not as clean as that. Okay, so now what do we do? Well, now we have only positive data, and there are lots of options to go at this stage. All right, well, I didn't even talk about smoothing yet. Oh, I'm gonna have to go back in time. All right. Because what I would typically do is smooth my entire data set before I extract. All right, so this maybe would be step 3, but it would happen up here. Boy, oh, okay. I'm gonna have to go back in time again. Sorry, I should have written all these things down before I actually started it. All right, the third thing that we might do here with this data set prior to extracting is smooth. Now, smoothing or filtering, AKA filter, there's lots of different filters we can use, especially with EMG. And at this stage, I would, again, I have to decide ahead of time where I'm trying to go with my EMG processing. For example, I've done a lot of work where we look at patterns of muscle activity. And when we look for patterns of muscle activity, we use a pretty aggressive filter, and we're looking for these general peaks and troughs of a signal. And we're not looking for the granular level of detail in that is in EMG. Okay, so I'll come back and talk about that in a little bit. But there's lots of options with smoothing. Oh, I'm already going down a rabbit hole with EMG processing, smoothing. Lots of options. And you really gotta think about this ahead of time before you actually collect your data, because it does impact. You always want to do a good job of collecting your data, but you really want to be thinking about your analysis down the road. I'm going to do this bullets, not because there's not a complete list. This is not a complete list. General smoothing. I would run a general smoothing to get rid of high frequency noise. So if my sample rate is something like 1,000 hertz, which is typical for EMG, anything over 500 hertz, but 1,000 hertz, I think our Cometa system is 2,000 hertz, that's fine. I may do a cutoff frequency and do a low pass filter of something like, if this is 1,000, I have to put my cutoff frequency is below 500. So maybe I would do something like a 300 hertz cutoff as an example, okay? Just to get rid of any real high frequency noise that may be existing. And I only do this again if I'm in a time domain analysis. If I'm doing frequency domain, I actually don't do this step because I'm going to do a frequency analysis to capture all the frequency content of the signal. I don't want to smooth it out ahead of time. So I would do a low pass filter, and I would get rid of any high frequency spikes in the signal. Then sometimes you're actually going to do a smoothing routine to get rid of movement artifact. This may be some real low frequency information in the signal due to running and you hit the ground and that EMG signal or sensor moves and just creates a movement artifact. In this case, maybe our cutoff frequency would be something like a 4 hertz, and this would be a high pass. If I use both a low pass and a high pass together, I would call this a bandpass filter. Okay, I call it a bandpass filter, where we combine a low and a high pass smoothing routines. All right, if I'm going down to patterns, well, now I'm going to use a low pass filter, maybe anywhere from 10 to 12 hertz, and sometimes even lower, because I'm trying to really find that movement or where EMG is peaking and where it's having a minimum. And I'm not so interested in the magnitudes when I start doing this type of analysis, okay? So this I would do if I'm looking for some type of pattern analysis. Okay. All right, let's get back to time domain. All right, so that's some things that I would do prior to getting to a more in-depth time domain analysis. Okay, so we're still in time domain, but these are all options, and you've got to think about them ahead of time before you actually collect your data. And now I'm back to this, and maybe I've done some smoothing, but I've done DC bias remove. I've done a full wave rectification, and maybe I did a general smoothing routine. Okay, let's just put those steps down. All right, so now, oh man, still lots of options at this point. Maybe what I want to do, time domain, is just calculate the average EMG of that extracted data set. And we just mathematically calculate the average, okay? Maybe what I want to do is integrate the EMG signal. And the integration that we worked on with our counter movement jump would be the same thing. Integration would be calculating the area under this curve. Okay. Let's see. Okay, in time domain, maybe what I want to do is identify when the muscle is on. So onset, and I'll put offset here. Okay, when the muscle's on and off. And off is not a correct word, but hopefully the concept makes sense. What I would do there is I identify a threshold above when, or a threshold that I would identify when the EMG is above and below that threshold. And I would record the time that these events happen. Okay. I record the time that these events happen. And this would make more sense if I was doing something, like this, where multiple cycles, and maybe we say, oh, this muscle's on here, it's off here. So we are not actually analyzing the magnitude here. We're just identifying when the muscle's on or off. All right. And we would end up with a plot that would look more like this. And muscles on, it's off, it's on, it's off, like this. It's on, it's off, like so forth. All right, and so that it's not actually representing magnitude, it's just representing when the muscle is above or below a threshold. Integrating, what I should have also mentioned with integrating, it is the area under the curve. But you can also do some resets. And what you can do is you can reset the integration back to 0 when the integration reaches some voltage level. All right, and then what you actually do in this type of analysis is you actually count how often the signal resets. Right? That ends up being meaningful. And same thing, you could reset if you're doing more of a, when a muscle's on like this over a long period of time, you could reset over a time period. And then again, you would count how often there are the muscle turns off and on, and you're counting that that number of resets within the time period. All right, so some other ways rather than just adding up or integrating the signal under the curve. Let's see. And in order to do this, I need to be able to identify that threshold. And that threshold often we calculate based upon some quiet period of EMG. All right, now I've kept I've kept all these figures in millivolts, all right? One of the things that we do in EMG is we don't use millivolts as our base unit for our analysis or our presentation of data. We normalize the data. And that normalization can actually happen at any period in time, but you need something to normalize the data to. We just add in EMG normalization. To normalize, you need some level of activity of the muscle to call 100%. And this is tricky, okay? Now, we're used to normalizing data in ground reaction forces. We normalize the body weight because we know what body weight is, that's predictable. And if we measure body weight today, we can measure body weight tomorrow, the next day. And it's a fairly easy number to get. Now, it's not necessarily consistent day to day, but hopefully you know what I mean, in that it is a number that if you stand on our scale, you stand still, we can reliably and validity measure how much you weigh. But knowing what 100% EMG activity is really tricky. A very common way to first figure out what is 100% is to use a maximal voluntary, as opposed to an imposed, isometric contraction. So you can do a non-voluntary, you can shock the person, okay? That is a way to do it. We don't typically do that in our lab, but we do an MVIC. Or sometimes you'll see, we'll get lazy, we'll just say maximum voluntary contraction. But the isometric part does indicate that you are not moving. And that there are some advantages to doing EMG where you're not moving the joint or the muscle, because the leads do move under or move with the skin, and the muscle can move underneath the leads, and we do want to minimize that if we can. All right, so we can do an MVIC. It seems simple, but it's not. Some muscles are really easy to do an MVIC for: the bicep brachii, the rectus femoris, knee extensors, elbow flexors, extenders, knee flexors, extenders. Those are typically easy, but to do an MVIC of the abductors or the gastrocnemius or the pectoralis major, or even the anterior posterior deltoids, these are not easy muscles to consistently, reliably get an MVIC. It's not that the person isn't trying each time, but it's not easy. So that's just something to keep in mind. But this is also why we typically just do EMG in repeated measures designs, because this MVIC becomes less important for repeated measures designs when you do not take the leads off the skin. So within a day, within one testing session, within one person. If you do between days, or if you are interested in between people EMG, you really have to think carefully about what is 100% and how to represent that for each person. Again, from ground reaction forces, we measure body weight. That's easy. Stand on a scale, that 100% force is called 100% body weight. So if we do 2 times body weight, we see 2 times body weight, that has a mean. It's 2 times the person's standing weight. But MVIC is a little bit tricky, and you'd have to do MVIC for each muscle. You don't do it in one contraction. So if you're doing 4 muscles, you've got to do MVIC, you got to record that 4 times, 4 different actions in 4 different muscles and 4 different data sets. All right, now we typically do this, and we do it because a lot of times reviewers ask for it. There are some other ways to do it, and what we'll typically do when we don't do MVIC is we set some condition to 100%, okay? Or even, and this could be average within that condition. It could be a peak value within that condition, and we call that condition 100%. And when we do that, we end up with data sets where 100% would be one condition, and then the next condition maybe would be something at 90%, and maybe the other condition is something like 110%. But now these numbers are relative to this condition. And graphically, this is a great way to illustrate how EMG is either going down or up for other conditions. Statistically, this is terrible to deal with because if every subject has the same value, 100, for a stat analysis, it doesn't work. So this we do more for what we do, more for illustration purposes. Okay. Not for analysis. Now, there are ways, and I am seeing more people start to use some condition or some other movement, I guess related to this would be some functional movement, and calling that 100%, and then normalizing all the data to that. For example, pull-up. We were exploring that for doing some swimming, or maybe some squat activity for lower extremity. But you would set the weight, you would set the movement parameters to try to get consistent data, and the EMG during these movements would then be set to 100%, and all the other data for all the conditions would be normalized to whatever value we see here. Okay. Right, so EMG normalization, you got to spend some time on that, but remember, repeated measures makes this step a little less important, but at the end of the day, we may even do some normalization for illustration purposes. Okay, where did I lead off? I did average EMG, I talked about processing, I talked about integrating. I think that is our time domain analysis. All right, so I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll add another video for some frequency domain. All right, thanks.